You should be grateful for 5%. My uncle slid the contract across the boardroom table like he was offering me a gift. I frowned. 5%? He nodded. That's more than you deserve. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. 23 executives sat frozen, staring anywhere but at me. I looked down at the contract again. 51%. Richard Whitmore. 5%. Adrian Whitmore. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. Then our company attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, if you'll sign the last page, we can complete the transfer before noon. I stared at him. Transfer? I hadn't come here to give away my grandfather's company. I came because today, I was finally supposed to become its CEO. I looked around the room one last time. That's when I noticed something I should have seen the moment I walked in. Every copy of the contract already had a signature, except mine. Richard pushed the contract slightly closer. Adrian, nobody is taking anything from you. I looked down at the papers. 5%. That was the number he wanted everyone to focus on. Not the billions in value. Not the years my grandfather spent building this company. Not the promises made before he died. Just 5%. You should be grateful, Richard said. The words landed heavier than the contract itself. Around the table, nobody reacted. Because they had already heard this speech. Maybe they had even practiced their expressions. 23 executives. 23 signatures. 23 people who had walked into this room knowing exactly how this would end. I picked up the contract again. How long has this been prepared? Richard didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me enough. Adrian, this is not personal. That's what people say when it is. A few executives looked down. Nobody defended him. Nobody questioned me. Because this wasn't a meeting. It was a performance. They weren't here to discuss my future. They were here to make sure I accepted it. Richard checked his watch. A small movement. Almost invisible. But he did it again. And again. The deadline. He cared about the deadline more than the conversation. Why does this need to be signed today? Richard's expression tightened. Because that's the schedule. No. I leaned forward. Because you're worried about what happens if I don't. For the first time, the room felt different. Not uncomfortable. Careful. Like everyone was afraid I had asked the wrong question. Richard reached for the contract. Adrian, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. But I didn't give it back. I turned the pages slowly. Page 1. Ownership transfer. Page 2. Voting rights. Page 3. Board authority. Everything looked designed to make me angry. To make me feel insulted. To make me rejected emotionally. Then I noticed something. A small detail. Something nobody else in the room expected me to see. The page numbers. Page 6. Page 7. Then suddenly, page 9. I stopped. My eyes moved back. Then forward again. There was no mistake. A page was missing. I looked up at Richard. For the first time since I entered the room, he looked uncomfortable. What happened to page 8? Nobody answered. Not Richard. Not the executives. Not even the lawyers sitting at the end of the table. And that silence was louder than any confession. Because contracts don't accidentally lose pages. Not billion-dollar contracts. Not agreements prepared by lawyers and reviewed by executives. Someone removed it. I closed the folder. The 5% wasn't the real story. The humiliation wasn't the real story. The entire meeting wasn't designed to convince me to accept less. It was designed to make me sign before I noticed what was missing. I looked at Richard. Someone didn't create this contract to make me sign it. His face went still. They created it to hide something. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone in that room knew There was only one question left. What was on page 8? Inside the folder was a single document. Not a contract. Not a letter. A copy of the original shareholder agreement. I immediately recognized the difference. The agreement Richard gave me had been carefully designed. This one wasn't. No edited language. No missing sections. No new conditions. Just the document my grandfather created years ago. I flipped through the pages. Everything looked normal. Until I reached the final section. A handwritten note was attached. Not a warning. Not an explanation. Just one sentence. If you are reading this, Richard has made his first mistake. I stared at the words. My grandfather didn't write things without a reason. He didn't leave dramatic messages. He left instructions, which meant this wasn't about Richard taking control. It was about something Richard had done while trying to take control. I searched the folder again. Nothing else. No explanation. No list of accusations. No evidence. Only that sentence. Richard had made a mistake. But what mistake? I looked back at the shareholder agreement. Then I noticed something. A date. The original agreement had been updated 3 months before my grandfather died. 3 months. At first, it seemed meaningless. Until I checked the records from the board meeting where it was approved. The meeting date. The attendees. The signatures. Something was wrong. Richard had signed the updated agreement. But he wasn't supposed to be there. Because according to the official company records, Richard was out of the country that week. I froze. That wasn't a small error. That wasn't paperwork. Someone had lied. And suddenly I understood. Richard hadn't just changed the company structure. He had changed the history of how it happened. The next morning, I called the company attorney. He answered immediately. Too quickly. Like he had been waiting. Adrian, you knew about the original agreement. Didn't you? Then, your grandfather told me never to discuss it unless you found it yourself. I looked at the folder. Why? Because the attorney's next words changed everything. Because the original agreement wasn't created to protect Richard from losing the company. I waited. It was created to protect the company from Richard. My grip tightened around the phone. What does that mean? Another pause. Then his voice dropped. It means your grandfather knew Richard would eventually try this. I looked out the window. At the city. At the company my grandfather built. At the empire Richard was already claiming. But if he knew. I stopped. Because I finally understood the real question. If my grandfather knew Richard would betray us, why did he allow Richard to gain control in the first place? The attorney was silent. Then he said, because your grandfather wasn't trying to stop Richard. I frowned. What was he doing? The answer came quietly. He was waiting for Richard to make a mistake. I looked down at the note again. If you are reading this, Richard has made his first mistake. For the first time, I wasn't chasing what Richard had taken. I was chasing what Richard had accidentally revealed. And somewhere inside the missing pages, hidden agreements, and fake signatures, was the mistake that could destroy everything Richard had built. Richard believed he had won. And for a few days, everyone believed it too. The headline said the same thing. Richard Whitmore takes control of Whitmore Industries. Founder's grandson steps away after leadership dispute. The world didn't see a betrayal. It saw a young man who couldn't handle power. That was Richard's greatest achievement. He didn't need to destroy me. He only needed to make everyone believe I destroyed myself. 3 days later, I received another invitation. The boardroom. Again. The same room where Richard offered me 5%. The same room where everyone watched me lose. But this time, I noticed something different. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody looked guilty. They looked confident. because they thought the story was already finished. Richard sat at my grandfather's old chair, the chair he had wanted from the beginning. "Adrian." He smiled. "I'm glad you came." I didn't sit. "Why am I here?" Richard leaned back. "Because every story deserves a final chapter." The company attorney stood beside him. My eyes moved toward him, but this time, he didn't look nervous. He looked disappointed. "The board has approved the final transition," Richard said. "Effective immediately, Adrian Whitmore will no longer have any operational authority within Whitmore Industries." I nodded slowly. "You needed my signature." Richard smiled. "Yes, but you don't need it anymore." "No?" He looked around the room. "Because you made your choice." There it was. The story. The one Richard had carefully created. He wasn't removing me. I was leaving. At least, that was what everyone would believe. And then I understood something. Richard didn't just want control. He wanted innocence. He wanted history to remember him as the man who saved the company, not the man who took it. That evening, I met Daniel Cross, my grandfather's former attorney. He placed a folder on the table. "You were right." I looked at him. "About what?" "Page 8. My hands stopped. He opened the folder. Inside was the missing page. The page Richard removed. The 5% was never your inheritance. I looked confused. Then what was it? Daniel looked at me. "A test." He pointed to the agreement. "Your grandfather knew Richard would eventually try this." "The board takeover?" "No." Daniel shook his head. "The mistake." I read the clause. Slowly. Carefully. And then I saw it. The 5% wasn't reducing my power. It was measuring Richard's intentions. If Richard attempted to force a transfer, manipulate ownership, or remove me from leadership through pressure, the founder's reserved shares would activate. Not for Richard. Not for the board. For a protected voting trust. Controlled by me. I stared at the document. So Richard thought he was taking power. Daniel nodded. But he was activating the mechanism that could take it away from him. For the first time in days, I felt something I hadn't felt since the boardroom. Hope. Richard hadn't beaten me. He had triggered Grandpa's final defense. Then Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He simply turned the phone toward me. "A news alert. Richard Whitmore announces major company restructuring." I frowned. "Why does that matter?" Daniel looked at me. "Because he already knew." "Knew what?" Daniel opened another document. An old communication record. A message from Richard. Sent months earlier. The words were short, but they changed everything. "I am aware of the Founder Protection Clause. Proceed with the transition anyway." I stared at the screen. My confidence disappeared. "Richard knew?" Daniel nodded. "Your grandfather prepared for him." "But Richard prepared for your grandfather." The room became silent. Because suddenly the game had changed. Richard wasn't walking into a trap. He knew the trap existed. And he stepped inside anyway. Why? Daniel closed the folder. Because he believes he found a way around it. I looked back at the missing page. At the clause my grandfather spent years creating. The weapon I thought would save the company. Richard knew about it. And he still chose to take control. Then my phone rang. "Richard." I answered. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Did you find page 8? I didn't respond. He continued. "Your grandfather was brilliant. But he made one mistake." I tightened my grip. "What mistake?" Richard laughed quietly. "He prepared for the man I was. But he never prepared for the man I became." The call ended. I looked at Daniel. Because now I understood. The 5% wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. My grandfather had left me a weapon. Richard knew I had it. And somehow, he still believed he was going to win. The question was no longer, what was Grandpa's plan? The question was, what did Richard change before I found it? Richard Whitmore spent the next 7 days celebrating. That was his mistake. He believed winning a battle meant understanding the war. Every headline praised him. Every executive followed his instructions. Every employee saw him as the man who saved Whitmore Industries from an inexperienced successor. Richard had control, but he didn't have trust, and he didn't realize the difference. Because the company he thought he had taken was watching him. The board was watching. The executives were watching. The employees were watching. And most importantly, the evidence was watching. Because Richard's greatest mistake wasn't trying to take control. It was believing nobody would notice how he did it. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Richard arrived early, confident, relaxed. He walked into the same boardroom where he had offered me 5%. The same table, the same executives, the same chair, my grandfather's chair. He sat down like it had always belonged to him. Then the doors opened. I walked in. The room went quiet. Richard looked up. For the first time in weeks, he looked uncertain. Adrian. I placed a folder on the table. Richard. He smiled. I thought we already finished this conversation. We did. I opened a folder. That's why we're having this one. The company attorney looked at the documents. His expression changed. Because he knew exactly what they were. Not just the missing page. Everything. The original shareholder agreement. The timeline of meetings. The private communications. The revised contracts. The records Richard thought nobody would connect. I looked around the room. This isn't about whether I deserve this company. Nobody spoke. It's about whether Richard earned the right to control it. Richard leaned back. You think some old documents are going to change anything? No. I looked at him. Your own decisions are going to do that. I placed the first document in front of the board. The contract was prepared 3 weeks before my grandfather's funeral ended. Silence. Another document. The board meeting was scheduled before I was informed. Another. The shareholder agreement was modified without proper disclosure. The room changed. Not dramatically. Not immediately. But enough. Because powerful people don't panic when they see an accusation. They panic when they see proof. Richard had spent weeks building a case against me. He wanted everyone to believe I was emotional, unprepared, unable to lead. But every move he made created a record. Every shortcut, every hidden meeting, every manipulated document, every attempt to force me out. He wasn't proving I was weak. He was proving he couldn't win honestly. Richard looked around the room. You planned this. I shook my head. No. My grandfather prepared for this. He smiled. Your grandfather prepared for me. Then he leaned forward. But he made one mistake. The room went still. I looked at him. What mistake? Richard smiled. He underestimated how far I would go. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I understood. Richard wasn't denying what he did. He was proud of it. And that was exactly why he lost. Because my grandfather's plan was never built around stopping a dishonest person. It was built around revealing one. The board vote lasted 2 hours. Not everyone supported me. Some still doubted. Some still believed Richard's results mattered more than his methods. But enough people understood. Richard Whitmore was removed as CEO. His control agreement was challenged. The transition was reversed. The man who spent years trying to own Whitmore Industries discovered something painful. He never owned the company. He only borrowed control. And eventually, someone came to collect it. Before Richard left the boardroom, he stopped beside me. "You think this makes you a leader?" I looked at him. He smiled. "Your grandfather gave you a company. But he never showed you how ugly the world becomes when people want what you have." I looked at the chair behind him, the chair my grandfather spent decades sitting in. "No." Richard waited. He showed me something more important. "What?" "That leadership isn't proven when everyone supports you." I looked back at him. "It's proven when someone tries to take everything from you, and you still choose to become better." For the first time, Richard had no answer. 3 months later, I stood in front of the entire company. The same employees who watched me leave, the same people who believed Richard's version of the story. But this time, I wasn't standing there because of my last name. I wasn't standing there because my grandfather built the company. I was standing there because I earned the right to protect it. My grandfather left me many things. I looked across the room, but the greatest thing he gave me wasn't ownership. It was a challenge. The room became silent because ownership can be inherited. I looked around, but leadership cannot. I continued. My grandfather didn't want someone who simply received the company. He wanted someone who understood why it mattered. Someone who could protect the people who built it. Someone who could make difficult decisions. Someone who could stand alone when everyone else believed they had already lost. I smiled slightly. Richard thought he was taking away my future, but he was actually giving me the opportunity to prove I deserved it. That night, I returned to my grandfather's office. My office now. I stood beside the desk for a long time. I finally understood. My grandfather never needed to protect me from failure. He needed me to experience it. Because a person who inherits everything may know what they own, but a person who fights for everything knows what it is worth. Richard thought the 5% was an insult. He was wrong. It was the test. And he failed it. Not because he wanted power. Everyone wants power. He failed because he believed power was the only thing that mattered. My grandfather understood something Richard never did. A company isn't protected by the person who controls the most shares. It's protected by the person willing to fight for what those shares represent. And sometimes, the people who try to bury you don't realize something. They aren't creating your ending. They're creating the moment you finally discover who you were meant to become.